Good morning, everyone. Kia koutou mai haere mai. I'm Alan Fell, University of Auckland. Please make welcome Heide from HitLab, University of Canterbury.
Thank you, Alan. Kia koutou. Ko Heide Lukosch takoinga. I'm Heide Lukosch. I'm an associate professor at the Human Interface Technology Lab, or HitLab NZ, and also lead of the Applied Immersive Games Initiative. This is maybe the most difficult words that you will hear from me during this half an hour talk. However, the initiative is funded by the New Zealand government and the University of Canterbury to bring the games industry and academia closer together. I'm a social and media scientist from background. I worked a lot in e-learning and then turned to gaming 12-ish years ago. So I'm a games researcher and I know something about games from an academic perspective. So I have to embrace co-design together with game developers, but more importantly with content matter experts. And that's why I was motivated to talk a little bit about the projects that I was involved in, that I am involved in, some of the insights and elements of co-design I think are helpful, but also some of the questions that are still open and that we are discussing a lot at the HitLab. I also have to say that all the work that I'm presenting here is the result of co-design and is the result of collaboration with a lot of amazing, smart and creative students and colleagues at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, where I worked for a very long time before moving to the HitLab, and at the HitLab and of course other places. And this is the group of amazing researchers and students at the HitLab last year. So why co-design? When we talk about serious games, I would say in a very broad sense, these are games or applications that utilize game elements for motivation, engagement, collaboration, all these kind of things, but also to support people, organizations, society in learning, training, decision-making, and policy-making. That's how I would very broadly define them. But these games are very often made by game designers, researchers like me, or artists. So they know, again, a lot about game design and game elements, but they require the input, at least, of content matter experts like police agents or athletes. And ideally, we could use co-design methods to engage with the target group and with the envisioned players of these games. However, when we also think about co-designing for a specific target group, and at the HitLab we also design games for children or people with disabilities, it's very often that your design will also benefit a larger group. So if you, for example, design an application for blind people, that might also benefit elderly people with a poorer eyesight or people who are in a certain situation distracted and can't look at the application. And the Microsoft Inclusive Design tool is a very helpful tool to look into inclusive design, and that definitely inspires our co-design of work and games at the HitLab. Where I come from is in Delft. It seems as if you will not be able to see all my videos. I'm sorry for that. In Delft, games were seen as one way to understand the complex reality we are all living in. And they are seen as one medium next to more formal models like modeling and simulation, a more interactive way. That's a very specific stream of and an academic perspective to looking at games, and it describes the game design as a way where you first try to understand reality and a real system, which can be very complex with a lot of actors and elements involved, with a lot of relationships between these elements. And as a game designer, you try to grasp that and try to identify the elements of reality that go into your game design. And when players play the game, they create a new reality because they bring their own backgrounds and expectations and experiences. And in the whole design and play cycle, the debriefing or reflection phase is very important, where you give the players the opportunity to look back what they experienced in the game and then translate it back to reality. And that's how you can design complex systems or help people in learning and training. That's the cycle, and that's kind of my background and how I look at game design. That's very abstract and that's very academic. So how to turn this process into action. I think roughly since the 1970s, academics try to describe a process towards simulation or serious games. With the first that really published about it was Richard Duke in 1973. And he proposed 40 steps that a game designer should go through in designing a so-called simulation game. However, when you look at a lot of the game design approaches, it comes down to 5 main steps, which is specifying the design, like the requirements, the circumstances, the context, then conducting a systems analysis, doing the actual game design or game co-design, then the game development or construction, and the implementation. And I brought some examples for the first 3 steps because I strongly believe that the 4th one should be done by professionals like you. And the implementation is for me part of also the co-design process. So it's when the game will be implemented in an organization or in a school environment. And that has to be thought upon at the beginning already. Here in New Zealand, I also came across this approach, which is the so-called braided rivers approach by a colleague at the University of Canterbury, where we have these beautiful rivers. And this approach is about weaving together Western science streams with kaupapa Maori and really bringing these 2 perspectives genuinely together. Not only bouncing back and forth, but really trying to learn the best from the 2 worlds, which of course in designing games in this cultural context is very important, but it also can bring us some insights in how to bring different disciplines like game design and transportation management together. So this is something that we really embrace at the HIT Lab when designing games. Another approach is something that I'm currently working on with a colleague in the Netherlands, because when you look into scientific literature, you see a lot about you have to understand the problem that people have, and you really have to dig deep into what is the actual challenge that an organization has, for example, when they want to create a game around solving that problem. However, you don't see a lot of actual tips how to create a problem statement. And based on a lot of work that we did with professionals, we created what we call the funnel of game design, where we go through different steps of interviewing people, looking into literature, looking into websites, company descriptions, whatever, having discussions with experts, doing a Moscow analysis for the actual game, and then engaging with experts in what we call a game storm session, which is actually a brainstorm session with experts, with the target group around specific game elements. All that together is how I approach co-design, going through a relatively structured process. It's of course not going from 1 to 5 in such a stringent sequence, but it's also bouncing back very often, and it's more a messy process than it looks on the slides. But it's very helpful to have an idea and to create a process that works for you, I think. So for me, that works very well. It includes a lot of work, a lot of homework before engaging with experts, because you want to know a little bit about the domain, and I worked for very different domains before engaging with the experts, knowing the field. I brought you some examples, as I said, because I know that this is quite academic. So design specifications are about really understanding what the underlying problem is when somebody comes to you and says, oh, I do want to have a learning game because my people don't communicate well in my organization, sometimes there are other problems at hand, or you want to understand why it is a problem that these people don't communicate with each other. So really like digging deep into the problem and the objective of the game. Is it actually learning or training, or do you want to support people in their decision-making processes? It's also the conditions of the design process. So how big is your budget? How much time do you have? And certain requirements and requests for specific game elements that might be important for a specific organization or client. And then the use of the game, which like also relates to the implementation of the game. The outcome usually is a report with specifications, and the more detailed it is, the better it is for everyone involved in the co-design process, because they can understand why certain elements, why certain decisions are important. This is an example of a project that we did together with the Dutch police, where actually the Dutch police came to us, the Game Lab in Delft, asking for a highly realistic digital game to teach situational awareness and communication to a police team. They wanted to have a single-player online game, which was easy to play for non-experienced players. That's 10 years old, so the characters in the game look a little bit very artificial. They follow certain predefined paths. But if you've ever been to The Hague in the Netherlands, you will immediately recognize that this is a part of the inner city there. That's where the police agents worked, and that's why they wanted to have such a highly realistic game. Being a research unit, we followed their wishes and their design specification. However, in the end, we saw that like for communication training, this wasn't really important. For the awareness part, it was. And what we actually did, we talked a lot to the police agents working in that area, to their managers, to educational providers who like designed a lot of police training. We engaged in role play where like we were the bad ones chased by police agents. That was really, really helpful in the whole co-design process to actually experience how it feels to be on the other side. The listening part, I'm not so sure. So like we designed and followed, again, a relatively structured process where we had like brainstorming sessions with the experts. We designed 2 different versions of the game that we tested, and like that was fed back into the whole game design. But being researchers, we really wanted to like create valid results. So we based our game test sessions on like research instruments, questionnaires, and we created way too complex and way too long questions for the talk and listening. So that never really worked out very well. That's a really good learning part for like, especially for us as researchers, to make it easy for the players. And I have an example where I think we did a better job in that. Moving on to like the systems analysis. So the design specifications in my work are very often set by a certain client, which is sometimes the HR department or a management who says like, I want my people to learn this and that. That of course usually has a certain relation to like the underlying problem and the real world. But what you want to do is really gather an understanding of the elements of a system and their sometimes really complex relationships. What are actors? And usually you come across things that you've never thought about before that have an influence on like the game and like the real system. That outcome of that is like a more abstract model of reality that can inform your game design, and where you decide on like what kind of elements and actors are really important, which should go into the game. And sometimes more importantly and sometimes more difficult is what elements do I have to leave out? Because in like the case of the police, where they said like, oh, it has to be really highly realistic, it's of course extremely expensive to do so. So it's good to understand and to like make brave decisions on this is not like needed. It will not add a lot of value to the learning goal. For the systems analysis, this is another project from the Netherlands where we created a game for an innovation in the transportation domain, which is called truck platooning, where you have like a lot of technology that connects trucks that follow each other automatically, and that's thought to be more sustainable and energy efficient. So what we did was trying to understand like a lot about the innovation. We talked a lot with like technicians, with suppliers, with truck drivers, created that model, and we also like joined test sessions when these trucks were driving around in a rather empty space, fortunately, in the Netherlands. And we followed another academic model of game design, but we also went back to like the drawing table with just pen and paper together with the experts to create really low fidelity prototypes to really decide together with the transportation engineers what are the elements that like influence this innovation and what's important for the actors to know about. We also played a lot, so we created different versions of the game. In that case, it was a board game that we made. And being at a university always has the advantage that you have access to students who are usually very happy to help you and play your games. So we played this with transportation engineering students, with game design students, and then we went out to companies in the Netherlands. A lot of companies and governmental organizations are very much familiar with the idea of playing games in decision-making processes when they want to like try some innovations and want to play around with the system and see how the system would react on the innovation. And we were also able to like play it with senior professionals at a transportation conference. And you see that like the game really changes. So the important thing here is, again, when you play it and you play prototypes in a co-design process, that you actually listen to the players and listen to the feedback, take it seriously, and take it into account. In comparison to the police project, what we did better here, I think, is that we designed some of the game material, and this is one of the event cards from the game, in a way that we can use it in the co-design process. So the use of the game material of the players can inform us on like what kind of strategies they did, like whether they understood what our aims and goals for the game were. So we didn't have to rely only on questionnaires after the game or a conversation. We could use the game material. And we also tried to listen a little bit like beyond the actual game session. So we looked at like the social media feeds of the players and whether they said they liked it or not. That might be like a usual thing for you when you work at a games company with like community managers. For us as researchers, there's no such role. So that's all part of like our own work and research to gather insights in how the players experience the game and what they say, what we can learn from that for further improvement and design. Again, I said like I come from a group that dealt with a lot of complex systems and complex systems design. And there is a lot of work in that field on the use of games in that. So I would almost say that was relatively easy. But what about co-design with a small group of usually very busy experts that don't have like a lot of time to engage with you in co-design, like high-performance sporters? What about co-design with children, a very specific user group, or individuals with special needs, or across cultures, what we have to do here in New Zealand? So last year, we designed a game for the skiers and snowboarders of New Zealand who went to the Beijing Olympic Games, and we created 2 virtual environments for helping them preparing for the competition. It is a really small number of experts, so we had to rely on like the limited time that they gave us and their stories that they were telling us. Again, we also engaged with like an educational provider who works a lot in training with high performance athletes, but also like pictures and data that we could, like everything that we could gather be used for this. This virtual environment is a simulation of it doesn't need to be Anyway, it's a simulation of the waiting and preparation room for where the athletes prepare for the competition. And it was also tested with a small group, so we were able to go down to Wanaka and play. Thank you very much. Go down to Wanaka and play it with the athletes who went to the Olympic Games. While it's not data that we can generalize, but what we saw, for example, is that this environment is very helpful for unexperienced sporters who have not been to such huge competitions before. They can go through this experience and then they are already a little bit familiar how it feels to be at the competition. What can happen? And it's very useful for the exploration of this new technology to use virtual reality to prepare athletes. And again, we were really lucky to being able to work together with them, but we had to deal with the very limited time that they had available for the co-design process. Co-design with children. And you don't see the video of children playing a VR game in school, is different because children are a vulnerable user group. We usually have to get the consent of the caregivers if they engage with us in experiments when they are under 18. That takes a lot of time and energy. Especially this was a game made by one of our PhD students for children with attention deficits, especially when we use immersive technologies. And it was really funny because it was unfortunately only boys because they had to volunteer to join our study. And they were all putting a really brave face on when coming from the VR environment, which is a very calming environment. But still, when we asked them whether they felt motion sick, and everyone said, no, not at all, but they were almost green in their faces. So you have to make sure that you can identify risks around the co-design process with children and mitigate them. They, of course, when we try to use research instruments that are usually made for adults in the co-design process, they may not be well understood by children. Maike, the PhD student, she did a lot of work to figure out whether there are some instruments that are made specifically for children, and these smileys come from a so-called smilometer that we use, and that was really helpful. So there's these easy instruments together with observation. That was very helpful. Again, the listening part in the co-design process was more challenging. Yesterday, I heard that on the one hand, children are really honest. So when you ask them about whether they like your game, they usually tell you very quickly whether it's shitty or not. But this was in a school environment, and their children are also heavily socialized to give correct answers. You will be able to hear more about designing games for individuals with special needs at 11 o'clock in the Sounding Theater. By our PhD students Zoe and Grace, where she designs games for the deaf and hard of hearing community. We also have Zoe, who is designing a game for young adults with social anxiety. And what we at least discuss around doing games with and for these groups is do no harm. So engage in a way that they feel respected when you work with individuals with lived experience, because we all are now psychologists. We have to make sure that they understand we are designers. We want to design something together and give back to them, and be really serious about the co-design aspect. So not only engage with them for kind of a greenwashing of your design, but really listen and take the feedback seriously. However, we also have a lot of discussion whether it is actually appropriate to design with and for a group that you don't belong to. And that's just an open question, but we try to be at least aware of that. And I think that applies also in designing across cultures. We do have a large national research program where we design games for risk awareness for children. And when we talk about natural hazards or natural phenomena like volcanoes, They come, of course, like with different stories, different symbols, different words that are like understood in different cultures. And Simon in the back yesterday talked about like really looking onto like a micro level, a regional level, like how people communicate about these phenomena. And how can we then make sure that a game design is appropriate, meaningful, and multi-perspective? And we do that in like engaging again, especially in these projects with Maori designers, with Maori researchers, and also with children who identify as Maori. Again, the question is, can we actually and should we? So to summarize, how to co-design, I think for me, it's very helpful to approach co-design as a process where you really engage with the target group, with stakeholders along the whole process, but also as an activity in like co-design workshops and brainstorming sessions where you have people from different perspectives, but also co-designing the instruments. So we use a lot of personas in our game design processes. And we also like designed this instrument in one of the projects together with the EV to really understand whether we are on the right track. And talk to the people, create like opportunities that they can give you feedback, play. Like I don't think I have to tell you about how important it is to like test play, and really listen to the feedback of the people, and how important like the human side in like the development of all that fancy technology really is. I think the time is almost up. I'm not sure whether we have anything for questions, but I'm really happy. You can always reach out to me if you have questions, comments, ideas. Thank you very much. There's maybe one time for one question.
Oh, we have time for 1 or 2 questions, yeah? Did anyone have any questions they wanted to ask, or?
So you're using a lot of research methodologies to put this up.
Sure. There it goes.
No, it is. You're using research methodologies to develop games for outside users, but are those users then sort of using that as a tool to improve real world systems as well? Are they kind of taking learnings from that, or
From the research methodologies, you mean?
no, more from analyzing how users interact with the tools you've created, and taking learnings from that to maybe develop real world systems?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. So, and we really saw that, especially like in the co-design process is already a learning process for a lot of organizations when they engage with a problem from a different perspective and with a different goal, which is to create a game, which makes the whole process already a little bit less serious, but more insightful. And this example, for example, is a game that we made for the transportation department of the city of The Hague. And that's a very simplified and abstract version of the city. And then they were able to like create new solutions for a congested city. And they played against each other in teams, but like all the teams came up with one solution, independent from each other, and that's a solution where they try to find ways how to implement it in reality. So that's like beyond training, but where they really were able to improve their decision-making processes. Okay, so, yeah, and as I said, like,
I'm just curious what you found as like a technique that really worked with extracting like true information from children.
Sweets. No, as I said, like in you couldn't see the video, unfortunately. But we went into the school with our VR equipment, let the players play the game, asked them to, if they had any questions or comments, to say out loud, speak out loud. We observed what they did during playing. We tried to like use some child-friendly instruments. That helped a lot because the immediate reaction, I think, was very honest. What didn't work at all was like sitting down after the test with the children, asking them questions. because that was just a yes or no, and then they just wanted to flee. So I think engaging in experiences or like creating a game design workshop, which is also a little bit gamified and engaging in itself. So creating an activity where they can give feedback and we're not confronted with, I want to get to know something from you. That works very well with children.
Yeah. Hey, one last one. I'll start heading over to the morning tea soon, but one.
Sorry, just to quickly follow up and reinforce what Heide is saying. So I work with deaf young people and children, and clinically we have a lot of emphasis on rapport building. So unfortunately we don't have the opportunity to form long-term relationships with the children, but we have to very quickly establish trust in order to get reliable and honest responses from them. So I think that's something that I'd like to bring to the games community a little bit more, and there are tools that we can do that.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Let's thank Heidi for